Hey everyone, you're listening to Live with Necee. I am your host, Opal Bailey, and I have a wonderful guest, DonnWeaver. He is here with me today from Brevard Veterans Memorial Center and Park. Hello, Don.
It's very nice to be with you today, Opal. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. You know what? I believe that it was a divine connection for me to come out to the Founders 50th
right, at
celebration.
The Cape Canaveral Park there and be together on a sort of a patriotic day and at the same time meet and go forward with this interview. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know what? I didn't see your Army on your shirt when I went there, but I just knew it was a connection. So
there you go.
Can you just tell us about yourself?
Well, sure. I first of all, I have my wife Jeannie and I, and she's sorry she couldn't be here today, but perhaps another time. My wife Jeannie and I were actually kids, space-age kids here in Brevard County. Grew up in Melbourne, Cocoa Beach, different houses at different times. So this has always been an area where we wanted to come back and live, and took many vacations here with our 4 children over the years. After I got out of high school, went on to college and joined the Army. I actually, in the Vietnam era, I actually enlisted in the Army. It's a good thing because I got drafted in the 7th week of basic training.
Oh.
So I went, the handwriting was on the wall, so to speak.
Yes, sir.
And I did the right choice because it gave me the program that I wanted to do to serve our country, 68 to 72. Sadly, like a number of military personnel the last couple of years, there was a reduction in force, and my wife and I, with 1 child and 1 on the way, were kind of caught. We're wondering, should we try to stay with the Army and not get booted out? I always remind people, 2 years ago, 1,000 Army captains, I was an Army captain at the time, 72, 2 years ago, 1,000 Army captains were fired while in combat in Afghanistan because of a reduction in military force. Our military size comes and goes, but it's sometimes caught in the middle at that point. So we went to graduate school at Florida State. I don't like anything resembling Florida Gators, so I'm a Seminole all the way in terms of, I'm just kidding out there.
I know.
But we did graduate school on the GI Bill at Florida State. Then we had 2 job offers, the University of Georgia as a lowest level possible professor, or the Foreign Service with the State Department in Washington, D.C. I chose the latter, and we spent 40 years until our full retirement in 2013, on staff and on contract in the Foreign Service, representing all of our listeners, the American people, abroad in 8 countries that we served in, and I've been in 102 countries. Had to learn 5 foreign languages, which became more difficult each one as I got older. But I feel very strongly that I got to do what I wanted to do in my life, and I did live the American dream. When we got out, there was no question we were going to come to Florida, Cocoa Beach, and live in Brevard County. And for about 3 weeks, I enjoyed my retirement. My wife said, okay, that's twice as much husband, half as much money. Get out and do something. So I came to the Veterans Memorial Center, and within a few weeks was joined and have been doing quite a few things with a number of organizations in Brevard County since then. But I've found that Brevard County was the right place for us to settle. 70,000 veterans live in Brevard, 22,000 active duty personnel. It's the 2nd highest county in the country in terms of percentages of veterans and military to the population, and it certainly supports the military, as we'll talk later, what's happened at the Veterans Memorial Center.
Wow. So were you a child of a military dad? Or
Exactly right. My father was in the Navy when I was born, and the war just had gotten over. I won't say that when my wife was born, but I'll say 1946, less than 1 year after victory in Japan against Japan. And he was in the Navy. He joined when he was 16. Like many Americans in World War II, lied about his age. They weren't checking paperwork too well then. So at 16, he joined the Navy, served on battleships and submarines. He was one of the few Navy people that was on the major Tarawa and other major campaigns in the Pacific. Then his battleship was refurbished and ended up at D-Day on Omaha Beach, supporting the troops storming the beach. He got the GI Bill like I did, and ended up finishing high school and getting a degree in electrical engineering in Massachusetts after spending 2 years back in the Navy in Key West. My first visit to Florida was when I was 3.5, spent 2 years in Key West. And at that point, he had finished and got into the space program through a company that was then called North American, became Rockwell, and was one of the contractors with NASA to put a man on the moon and everything else. My wife, I proposed to my wife on July 16th, 1969, as Apollo 11 was lifting off at 9:20 in the morning. She said yes, subject to making sure we had it, because I was going overseas at that point. So a year later, we got married in Cocoa Beach, and had 2 more years in the Army.
That was smooth.
It was a very smooth move. The only problem was a 16-foot boat, 9:30 in the morning, and there were 3 other women on board. So I had to maneuver them to one edge of the boat because I wanted to do this kind of alone. But we were both space-age kids. So, we knew each other since we were 12, 13. So it was, I picked the right woman. Our 47th anniversary is this October.
Wow, you did pick the right lady, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Tell us, what was it, the Army about? How was it like?
It was, sadly, it was a very different Army than it was now. I was in from 68 to 72, the height of the Vietnam War. I was able to go to Officers Candidate School, infantry, so I was an infantry officer. My first assignment right after training was to Korea, with then to go to Vietnam. But by the time the war evolved, by the time I was supposed to go to Vietnam, I ended up staying in Korea. And spent 14 months there before coming back. Ironically, I became a basic training company commander at Fort Dix, New Jersey, the same place I went to as a trainee. And in fact, my drill sergeant came back and worked for me as an Army captain, as my platoon sergeant. So he was worried that I would somehow be tougher on him like he had been on me, wisely so, but not the case. He and I are still friends.
Oh, that's wonderful. Do you have any regrets of what you've been through in the Army?
No, except for the one that I really wanted to stay in. But with the family, you just got to plan your life carefully. And I would never know if I would have been reduced from the Army, asked to let go. But I certainly was thinking about staying in, but I had already thought about what's called the military attaché program. In other words, to serve in embassies, which I ended up doing as a civilian for 40 years.
And what was that all about?
Well, in the State Department, we're tasked with representing our country all around the world. And the typical State Department career, about 2/3 of your time will be abroad, and the other third in Washington, in training or learning things or manning the desks to support overseas embassies. I did a wide range of things, from consular officer issuing visas to helping American citizens in jail in different countries. We served a total of 8 tours in Africa, 5 in Africa and 3 in Eastern Europe. And it was just a delight for me as an American, to take my service to our country in a very different way than most Americans enjoy. But at the same time, I am very proud of the fact that as our country, through 8 presidents that I've served, has evolved in its foreign policy, and despite the frustrations of the last few years, it is clear to me that we need to have Americans that will be the kind of people that will get the world to understand what America is really about. When you think about it, when you look at history, there is no other country that, on a basis of a document written 235 years ago, is still there and still functioning. And the way I put it, and related to the military, since the early 1900s, the United States has fought in major campaigns, lost huge numbers of people, and has not seized and kept an inch of ground. We are not a conquering power. We are a liberating power. And to me, that's very, very important. And one reason why I think that being a veteran now is an honor, because without veterans, we didn't liberate anybody. Without veterans, we're not America.
Well, you definitely said a mouthful there. I believe in honoring the veterans, because you served a lot. You endured a lot. Things that you can't even say.
Or you don't want to talk about.
Or you don't want to talk about, So I know that you've done a lot in the foreign countries. What are you doing now for the veterans? Well,
this is a very interesting thing. When I came back, my wife said, look, that's enough relaxing for you. You're driving me crazy. We have a condominium in Cocoa Beach that we bought in '08, but really didn't live in it till 2013. So we retired here then. But I do occasionally go back to Washington on contract, where I help military and other personnel get ready to go overseas, which is an honor because I spent so much time overseas. I do know how an embassy works and everything else to help. So, but what we had been to the Brevard Veterans Memorial Center several years before, took our kids as it was being built in the 90s, in the 2000s. It was established officially as a place in 1990 when the county broke ground and a building was created on the Veterans Memorial Center right behind Merritt Square Mall. And so that initial building led the way to a plaza where there are monuments to the various conflicts, a couple of helicopters that look great, an aircraft, Navy aircraft, and a tank, and some other things, but mostly monuments to those who've served and sacrificed in all our wars. I was very proud when we first got here that we were able to lead an effort with the help of so many at the Veterans Center to create what I've still seen as the first monuments and recognition that I've seen not on U.S. government property to those who've served in Afghanistan, a war, our longest war in history, still going on, and Iraq. And in fact, on the Afghanistan monument, there are 16 Brevard County residents, living predominantly in Brevard County, strong connections who were died in combat. But we also recognize the 1.5 million that served.
Yes, sir.
It's hard to believe, and many of them were the same people going back and forth many times. So the plaza developed, and at that point, I said, well, what can I do? And I started volunteering, and they asked me to take over some leadership roles at various times. And then I think the most significant thing that I was lucky enough to do is to be asked to head up the expansion program, to take it from the 1990s into the 2016s. They'd been trying for 15 years to expand the place. And I just said, what would make the most sense? So I said, let's challenge Florida, which is a veterans-friendly state, a veterans-friendly governor. He was a veteran in the Navy.
Yes, sir.
So I wrote an appropriation request to Tallahassee. We put it all together. I sent it off, not thinking that we would get it necessarily, because tight budget always in Tallahassee, a lot of vetoes. But it was approved in the summer of 2015 for $1.5 million to build a brand new 6,000 square foot, 2-story museum with a 3-story tower modeled after the same towers that were used during World War II along the Florida coast to look for U-boats for Nazi submarines. And, of course, it was all up and down the whole U.S. coast. And that program, civilians would go and volunteer with their binoculars to look and then report back to Navy contacts if they found anything, saw anything. So I just dove in, and that's been 2.5 years ago. And now I think I'm a little bit deeper than many would be, but I've enjoyed it. I belong to 5 different organizations, and they each have different ways that they support veterans. But the reason I wanted to come and talk to you today, Opal, is that we have an obligation as veterans. We have to remember one thing of today. Less than 1% of America's population is in the uniform of American Armed Services today. So veterans, all of us, have an obligation, I think, to reach out to the youth and bring them aboard, show them what veterans have done, maybe motivate some of them to raise their hand, remembering that since 1983, not one single American has been told to serve. Everybody has volunteered since 1983, the end of the draft. So we have millions of Americans who keep going, even when the wars and the danger and the difficulty increase on this war on terror, the challenge that they have today. So it's just an amazing thing, a responsibility, then to reach out and help veterans and really ask Americans to come to our facility to understand more about them and learn more. I'm very proud of the fact, for example, we had 200 Boy Scouts for 3 days and 2 nights last weekend. We're going to have over 100 young people at our Memorial Day ceremony. Scouts, Sea Cadets, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, JROTC. So they'll hopefully stay and see the museum. Everything else, we, of course, arrange for free food, so it increases the chances. Right. But we really want to reach out to them and a lot of other Americans. I think we had 2,300 visitors to